Our next speakers are in a different sector, one we haven't heard about. You may have joined the entrepreneur pitch sessions yesterday in the areas of education and technology. Education is one of those areas within the social enterprise and impact investing world that can be hard for, I think, for the for-profit and nonprofit world to navigate. It's traditionally been something that's provided primarily through public dollars, but there's obviously a need for additional investment in there. And how does the venture capital community, the impact investing community figure out where each of them can use the tools that they best have? So some folks that are trying to figure out how to use the best tool for each job are some of these LLCs that are being created by private foundations through philanthropic dollars, trying to figure out how they can use for-profit investments and nonprofit investments and everything in between to make an impact where it's needed. Please welcome to the stage Deval Patrick of Bain Capital and Jim Shelton of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative.
Thank you. Thank you. Want to be here?
Thank you, thank you.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
So I'm here with the extraordinary Jim Shelton, who has had leadership positions in philanthropy at the Gates Foundation, in government as the #2 in the United States Department of Education, in the private sector, most recently at 2U, and now as the lead of the Chan Zuckerberg Education Initiative, which is has its foot in all of those sectors. And we've been talking a lot this morning about inequality, issues of justice and fairness. We think of education in this country as the great equalizer. From all those perspectives and the vantage point you've had, where's the action?
I mean, I think you said it right. First, thanks for letting me be here. And by the way, that call and response on the good morning was pretty pitiful. The action is, as you said, it is an education. It is pretty much, not only in the United States, but around the world, a given that if you can produce a strong, not even a world-beating education system, that over a course of not even 2 full generations, you will go from being a developing country to a relatively thriving economy. And so the question then is, how do lots and lots of people access the opportunity that comes from great educational opportunity, both here in the U.S. and around the world? I like to make a distinction on a couple of different fronts, though, because education winds up meaning a lot of things to different people. And so the definition I'm using a lot right now is to say, education is teaching and learning, actually learning and teaching, with the overlay of politics, policy, and organizational norms. And the reason I make that distinction is that a lot of people spend a lot of time talking about those last 3, the politics, the policy, and the organizational norms.
Amen.
And if you said, where is the action in my mind today? The action is in, can you actually transform the most important part of that equation, which is the learning? Mm-hmm. Can you dramatically increase the learning outcomes through enabling teachers and the other people who play teaching roles to have very different tools and resources to support the learner, and for the learner to have the power to take learning in their own hands and make something big happen for themselves. Mm-hmm. So that, I think, is where the action is, and then being able to create very different kinds of solutions that allow you to do that. We can actually take a lot of the pressure off of our systems to try and figure out what's right, and actually have people really clear that they can get a better outcome for themselves with solutions that actually work for them.
Mm-hmm. And there's an element of this debate, this overlay that you talk about, which is around, some folks feeling that the public is leaking out of public education and being displaced by the private sector and private interests. How do you think about that? How should we think about that?
So for me, the public part of public education is about public access. It was about the guarantee, or the right to, and in many states it is that right, of a young person to be able to access education that at the time that these systems were created would actually allow them to move into the working class in America, and that working class actually allowed them to have a viable life. Outside the U.S., it is a similar promise that countries are trying to make to expand access and let people have access to the opportunity that comes through education that we just talked about. There was not at the time of the creation of the system, an argument about through which lens do you actually come into this system? Mm-hmm. Do you come through the public funding mechanism? Do you come through a mechanism governed by a traditional school board? Those weren't even the constructs at the time. Mm-hmm. It was the promise that you had access to opportunity. Mm-hmm. So for me, the question is always in the public context, how do you fulfill that promise? Mm-hmm. How do you fulfill it for everyone who deserves the right to have it? And how do we use our tax dollars that we're investing in creating those opportunities most efficiently to make sure those young people have it? Now, what I will say is schools and school systems, public schools and school systems evolved for a reason mm-hmm. to provide that kind of access. Mm-hmm. If we remember how they evolved first, though, they evolved first not allowing complete access for everyone.
Right.
And then second, as segregated, ensuring not equal access for everyone. Mm-hmm. And then we've tried to create a system that becomes both excellent and equitable at the same time, and we struggled mightily to do so. Mm-hmm. So I said all of that as context to say, I think we have way too many conversations about what kind of a school is, and much too little times talking about how excellent the schools actually are. Mm-hmm. The opportunity for kids to go to school is probably as good or better than a good school. It's as good or better today than it has been, frankly, for most Americans, for the majority of Americans, in decades.
In terms of school quality?
In terms of several things.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it. First, our graduation rates have, for the first time, gone up to the point where we're almost at 8% nationally, over 8% nationally. Like, that's only happened in the last 8 to 10 years. Mm-hmm. We continue to make improvement on our assessments, but it's in terms of both reading and mathematics. Mm-hmm. What has happened is that we have not gone down. The rest of the world has caught up. In many cases, it's actually passed us by. Mm-hmm. And the demands of what we need from our students has changed really dramatically. And so our schools are actually better than they were before. Mm-hmm. They just haven't gotten better fast enough. And they never have actually closed the equity gap that they had from the very outset. Mm-hmm. So the question for us is, how do we make them dramatically better than they are today? Mm-hmm. And how do we begin to use them to close that equity gap in a way and to be able to do it at scale? Now, this is the other part of the question about, are we crowding out the public and public education? Mm-hmm. The reality is that the demand for education, both elementary and post-secondary, mm-hmm. has never been higher. Mm-hmm. There have never been more people enrolled. We have more low-income and African-American and Latino students both enrolling in college and graduating from college than ever before. Mm-hmm. So that is not the question. The question is, when they enroll in those opportunities, are they getting to the outcomes that they aspire to? Mm-hmm. And then when they do it, are they burdened in such a way that, in fact, it begs the question of whether that was a worthwhile investment? Yeah. And that is something that does not need to be the case.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about the Chan Zuckerberg Education Initiative.
Sure.
And what it's about and how what your path was there. But before we go there, I started my career as a civil rights lawyer. Yeah. And one of the observations that occurred to me early on in that career when we were still working on school desegregation cases is that school desegregation was about asking the children to do what the adults wouldn't do, which is to say the adults wouldn't integrate the neighborhood, so we had the kids integrate the schools. We have, I think it's fair to say, walked away from the objective as a public policy matter of integrating schools, at least in a de facto way. Our schools, our K-12 schools, are as segregated, in some people's views, more segregated than ever. Should we care about this? Should it matter from a public policy point of view?
So I'm of 3 minds on this front. Sorry. One is, yeah, we should definitely care. We should care because of the cohesion of our society. One of the things, one of the big objectives of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative is personalized education. But one of the things that I would just become very, very clear about that our education system provided for many years mm-hmm. was a certain commonalities across the American experience. We all were doing a lot of things, reading a lot of things, having a lot of things that we shared in common. We were watching the same network television stations, et cetera. There was a shared common American experience, even if you came from a very different context. And so the notion of us having that shared context that began to build bridges by which we could actually begin to become a more integrated society than we were was, I think, ultimately pretty important. What we never did is really figure out how to get people to actually talk to each other and engage each other in ways that were productive so that they could live and work together and get comfortable with the notion that they would move into each other's neighborhoods.
Lead integrated lives.
Lead integrated lives.
Right.
And by the way, you don't have to sacrifice your individual identity in order to do that. Just throw that in there ad hominem. I think schools can and should play a fundamental role in that process. And the second part of it is the research is very clear that even more important in the racial integration aspect in terms of student outcomes, all the students do better if you have economic diversity in the school. And diversity, racial diversity and ethnic diversity also complements that. The third is when you actually look at the questions of diversity and like in the real sense, the research around the role that diversity plays in making healthy organizations. Like it is now like pretty much an undisputed fact that diversity of background and perspective actually adds to, especially when you're doing adaptive problem solving. And as a person who's focused on education and what it needs to do for the next century, for those of you not deep in the weeds on it, like that's what we need. Like the arithmetic and stuff like that, always super duper important, but the problems that we have to solve going forward, the kind of education our kids need, we need them in the business of learning how to do adaptive problem solving together, how to create together, how to solve, envision things that have been envisioned before. That will come through diversity. So that's the broadest perspective. I'll just end quickly on this point. That said, our neighborhoods have not integrated.
Right.
And so kids practically being on buses for a long time to get to an integrated school is, I don't think, a practical solution for many of a practical solution. So we have to figure out how not to have this burden keep falling on the kids. And especially when there are a lack of high quality school seats in low income communities, spending money to create more integrated schools when there's a complete lack of opportunity over here, I'd have a hard time making those allocation decisions. I didn't do it when I was in government, and I'd have a hard time doing it now.
So talk about the Chan Zuckerberg Education Initiative from this perspective and more broadly. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish?
Yeah, so it's really straightforward. Mark and Priscilla are really clear. Unlock human potential and increase learning 100x. It is a pretty...
By next year? The year after?
So, and promote equality. I forgot that part. Those are the long-term objectives. But for me, it is a pretty straightforward thing. In the education space, and frankly in many parts of the social sector, we've had two problems overall. One is, just as background, I had this innovation job when I first went into government. And one of the first things you figure out is, well, you better have a definition that you use. And for me, it was pretty clear that education suffered in two ways. One is that like our fundamental product had not gotten significantly better, significantly, not incrementally, significantly better over time, and that we needed solutions that were not just a little bit better, but dramatically better, and not just for a few people, but a lot of people. And so we both hadn't created things that were significantly better than the status quo, and we hadn't figured out what scale meant. And so when you talk to people that either invest, especially on the philanthropic side, they often talk in terms of tens of schools, maybe hundreds of schools, maybe thousands of students, when in fact we need to start talking in terms of millions if we want to actually overcome the issues of inequity. And we need to be talking about orders of magnitude of change when we talk about improvement. So here's the goal. The goal is that there's this thing called Bloom's 2 sigma problem. Has anybody in this room heard of that before? Okay, good deal. So this guy right here, we can talk after. Basically, this guy did a study that demonstrated that if you give a kid, the average kid in the class, a one-to-one tutor, they will outperform the other students in the class by 2 standard deviations. That means that 50th percentile kid moves to the 98th percentile. And this study has been replicated many, many times in many different contexts. So then you go, okay, well, if we can get our average kid, oh, by the way, and you take the bottom kids, they move up 2 standard deviations, and you close the gap. So over 90% of the students wind up in what would have been the top quintile of the students previously. So you say, okay, here it is. That's easy. One-to-one tutors for everybody. Why don't we do that? Well, where are you going to get all the people, and who's going to spend all the money? Mm-hmm. But if we know that we could do that, then we know the problem is not the kids. I mean, it's just that simple. It never has been, and it is not today, the kids.
Right.
It is our inability to figure out how to solve that problem. So that's it. Mm-hmm. We're going to try and solve that problem. Mm-hmm. And we're going to try and solve that problem really aggressively and figure out that we've demonstrated that you can do it at scale within a decade, and then figure out how you can actually get it to everybody shortly thereafter. I don't know what that means.
So there's this whole move in education policy, very much like in healthcare policy, to personalized approaches. In other words, that children learn differently. They have different issues. They have different stimuli. They have different paces.
Yeah.
Are there strategies around personalized teaching that you personally or Chan Zuckerberg are interested in and following?
Yeah. So again, I want to focus on 2 things. One is that our goal is to create learning outcomes that are dramatically better than anything else, and that our definition of success is not just somebody who scores better on tests, but it includes that full range of skills that you need to be awesome. Yeah. At your job, in your academia, whatever it is that your chosen field is, that you know how to overcome difficulty, and you can navigate and build social networks that allow you to, take on your initiatives and everything else. Mm-hmm. And there are strategies for how to do that. Mm-hmm. You see that Mark and Priscilla have already invested heavily in a school model called Summit, mm-hmm. where they have built a personalized learning environment for students at the secondary level. And you could probably carry it down through middle school. And there are several parts that are important. One is it focuses on the students' needs and where they are and meets them there, mm-hmm. and allows them to move at their own pace. Lots of people focus on that. Mm-hmm. What lots of people don't focus on is, this is also just as important, is that part of moving at your own pace means that you have demonstrated that you mastered the thing that you needed to get done last before you move on to the next. Mm-hmm. It's called mastery-based learning. And so you'll see lots of approaches to that. Mm-hmm. You'll also see in this environment, and you have to figure out what this looks like as you translate it down to smaller students. If you think about Montessori, I call Montessori the OG of personalized learning, right? Mm-hmm. It is, you are able to, within a constrained set of choices, guide your own learning and go where you want to go. Mm-hmm. As you get older, you get more and more freedom to go deeper and broader just as you like. Yes. And to find the ways that work best for you. Yes. And then ultimately, when we get really good at this, you should be able to do it anywhere. Like if I learn algebra over the summer, I should not have to take algebra just because I'm going to school in the 9th grade in the following year. And so we need a mechanism for people to get credit for what they've done outside of school, in school. And by the way, when you start talking about post-secondary and workforce, those kinds of models are going to be what drive the folks that you're going to want to invest in the future, mm-hmm. right? I mean, when you start talking about being able to have the world in which most professionals are going to live in, where they're going to change careers multiple times, mm-hmm. where the industries that they were in are going to evaporate underneath their feet, then the ability to move, get credit for the competencies you developed in your last role, and have them get a map for you very quickly of what the competencies are you need to be able to move to your next role, and then someone to be able to help you close that gap quickly, that is a good business. Yeah. And oh, by the way, those folks who are willing to get in that business and say, and I will bet on you getting the outcome you desire, and I'll get paid at least partially based on my ability to deliver the outcome that you're looking for, either you as the learner or employee or the employer. Yes. That's the future.
So let me ask you, we just have a minute or two left.
Yeah.
Back to a world you and I used to inhabit. What's the role of public policy?
So I believe when I went in, and I believe when I came out, that the role of best role of government is getting the context and the incentives right. Like when we do our jobs right when we're in government, it is natural because of the incentive structures we set up, both the carrots and the sticks, for people to want to do the right thing. In my context, I would say, my objective when I went in is that education has never had an innovation pipeline where lots of things get tried, The ones that work the best get vetted and they get packaged so that they can get broadly distributed to other people. And things that really prove themselves can get lots of resource, access to lots of resources to go to scale. Like that part of what you would call a market mechanisms in many sectors has never really worked in the education sector.
Has not.
Has not. Evidence has not mattered for whether or not you got more funding for years and years and years. And so setting up the context where what works gets access to more resources, like that's a perfect way for government to play in the game. Setting it up so that the benchmarks of what success looks like are clear and fair and transparent to the public, that's a really fantastic role for government. Funding the things where there are not market incentives or enough market incentives for folks to jump in and get it done. R&D in the education space, like not a great sector for folks to, where folks have made a ton of money. Therefore, we have, this is my cynical view, had lobbyists to lobby for our R&D money. And so we need to find ways to say we should be investing as much in learning science as we do in health science so that we can have as many breakthroughs on that front as we've had in the other areas. That's a great role for government to play and to make sure that those incentives lined up for people to do the right thing. And then also, as precisely as possible, to deal with the people who do bad things. And since we have 10 seconds left, I'm going to go over it by 30 seconds just to tell this story. Our higher education system is one of the best in the world. We were the first in the world to pioneer granting broad access to higher education. We set up a perfect system for getting access to education. We just forgot one thing. Graduation. We had no incentives built into the system to ensure the incentives were as high to get graduates as to get people in. Now, maybe that wasn't the right thing to do at the beginning, but then we had a whole sector of people who developed, who knew there was a lot of money to be made getting people in with no concern for whether or not they got out. Foresight. We got to bring it into government.
Thank you, Jim. Great to be with you. Thank you.